Welcome to the University of Uppsala, Sweden, where we are pleased to be hosting the international research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospects of Criticism. The project is conducted in collaboration with the University of Louisville, Kentucky, and is funded by the Templeton Religion Trust as part of their Art Seeking Understanding program. We are joined for today's seminar by Cynthia Freeland, Professor Emerita at the University of Houston, Texas, who talks to us about cross-cultural communication in art in relation to aesthetic cognitivism. Her discussion focuses particularly on the London-based Kashmiri artist Rakib Shaw. Okay, welcome everybody. We're delighted to welcome our speaker today, Cynthia Freeland from the University of Houston, Texas. Cynthia will be talking to us about aesthetic cognitivism across cultures. Cynthia, of course, needs no introduction from me. Her book, But Is It Art?, has probably been read by as many people as have asked the question. And she'll be speaking to us for about half an hour before we move on to the Q&A. So welcome, Cynthia.
Great. Yes, so let's go ahead and I'll try to be brief. Aesthetic Cognitivism Across Cultures is my title. My talk has two main parts with a preface, and so here are the parts. The preface is about my trip to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia last December, and then the first main topic is cognitivist aesthetics and communities, and the second one is about the contemporary Indian painter who lives and works in London, Rakib Shaw. Now, last December, I was able to fly to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and it was quite an experience. So I'll just share some pictures. This is a little bit touristic, as Guy said last time about the video that the Templetons had made about you guys, but there is a reason for it. So let's go ahead and just now. It's a lot of pictures, Guy. So this was quite an experience and very posh in many ways. You can see the hotel there. And so there was just a lot that was very foreign about it. So it's setting the theme up of communicating across cultures and communities. One of the rather striking things was that our hotel had a falcon in the lobby. So when I first saw it, I was quite sure it was a stuffed bird. It was hooded and it was just sitting there silent. And I thought, oh, how terrible, they've got this stuffed bird. And I reached out and touched it. I couldn't resist, and it moved and turned its head. And then later on, the handler was there and had taken the hood off and said I could touch it on its belly and it would be fine. It wouldn't strike me, but it was there because there is a falcon hunting contest near Riyadh at that particular time of the year. And so that was just one thing that was kind of new to me. So here's the library at which the conference was held on the left. That's the King Somebody Library, and it was quite a modern city, very high-tech environment. And this was a International Philosophy Congress, and it was the third annual one. And that's significant because until that time, philosophy, until 3 years ago, or 4 now, philosophy was banned in Saudi Arabia. Next. And it's the kind of curious fellow who has a bad reputation, MBS, who opened universities and schools up to philosophy. Now, the reason I was asked to go is because my book, But Is It Art?, that Guy so nicely mentioned, was just translated into Arabic, and I'm sitting next to this nice man, Mohammed Badr from Cairo, who was the translator, but the press is Saudi, and that was interesting to me because my book, as some of you may know, does deal with some controversial art that has to do with issues of religion and sexuality and homosexuality. So I was rather surprised they were going to translate it. And I was very leery about going, but this nice man, we corresponded, and he's the one who invited me, and he assured me I could talk about anything. And so on we go. And the theme of the whole conference was actually about communication across cultures in philosophy, but I was the only person doing aesthetics. So here's the hall that we met in, very high tech. On the left, you'll see at the opening ceremony, there were a bunch of the Saudi family princes. Okay, yes, go. And this is just to show more of the ambiance and the speakers. Next. And this was interesting because there was a debate contest among university students. This was the winning team. The presenters on the left giving the team a big check, so they won money, and the team had 2 young women and 1 young man. Next. And so here I was with some women who were at the conference, and they were from various Arab countries, and the woman on the right was from India. Next. And some men at an art exhibit that they had, an art exhibit of philosophers. And we visited a historic site outside of Riyadh that's where the Saad family had their palace in the year 400. Next. So this raised a lot of issues about what I could talk about that would be new and interesting. And I did talk about Ai Weiwei, among other artists. I wanted to talk about an artist who's been critical of his culture and government without being too pointed about it. And I think it went over fairly well. And some young women came to talk to me afterward and asked very sincere questions about my talk and the examples. And the most contemporary artist that they knew about was Duchamp. And I said, well, but what he was doing, that was 100 years ago, and they were just shocked. They thought he was that's made it interesting that's why they apparently picked the Duchamp for the cover of my book. So in particular, I wanted to talk about how art can communicate values across cultures. So now that's my theme for today. Let's next. Aesthetic cognitivism and community, next. Going all the way back to what I have done on this. Some of you may know my article, Art and Moral Knowledge, came out originally in 1997, and it's been anthologized, I'm happy to say, in the second edition of this nice big book. Next. And I have a lot of respect for Dewey. And in chapter 14 of his well-known book, Artist Experience, he talks about how art relates to culture. Aesthetic experience is a manifestation, a record, and a celebration of the life of a civilization. Next. He also has a chapter on criticism, and I'm not going to read these long quotes to you, but if you have the record of this, you can go back to it. But it's worth looking again in the context of what your Templeton grant is, since it involves a criticism. And in that chapter, Dewey does emphasize the point that the critic is helping the audience perceive the artwork and showing something that's in the artwork rather than making up a new artwork, him or herself. And also he emphasizes that critics need to know about diverse traditions. Next. Now, I'm sort of dedicating my talk to the memory of my good friend Jenny McMahon, who died last year, very sadly, of recurrence of breast cancer. I had met her in 1995 when I visited at the ANU in Canberra. She was a PhD student then, and an older student because she was already an accomplished artist who'd had a gallery in Melbourne and very successful, but came back to study aesthetics. And we became friends after that time. And when I visited Australia in 2011, we were able to go and visit Ayers Rock, or as they say now, Uluru, together. So I want to pay tribute to some of her work on Kant and the link to community. Next. So Jenny wrote some books, Aesthetics and Material Beauty and Art and Ethics in a Material World, with a great emphasis on arguing against formalist aesthetic interpretations of Kant and emphasizing the role of community in Kant. Next. And she talks about how the pleasures of art involve reception, language meaning, and reflective intersubjectivity. And she had a kind of interesting new interpretation of genius in Kant, the rational basis upon which a new form of feeling can be communicated so that an audience can recognize and endorse it themselves. And so fundamentally, the genius is giving the rule for art, but also communicating something to an audience through the use of form. So I think it's a kind of cognitivist twist on art. Next. And she emphasized the role of moral community in her 2013 book, and that's the one, Art and Ethics in a Material World. So the viewer encounters the object, develops concepts, communicates with others through these concepts and language, but the language and concepts are always already present to be used through the culture itself. And then through broader discussions, the artwork can contribute to novel, new forms of language and ideas and values being communicated through the art. So she says, art's ethical dimension is the purposive nature of its indeterminacy, which invites the kind of communication that leads to shared terms for norms and values. Now, you might think this is a little too optimistic, and perhaps it is, but that's why I'm going to talk about my example coming next. Okay, next. So Jenny led an Australian Research Council project, and I was part of it, a co-PI on it. And it was over 3 years, kind of comparable to your Templeton project. And we had artists, teachers, a lot of people were involved. We had one meeting in the art gallery in Sydney, where we each spoke on a particular artwork, each of the philosophers and the artists, and people followed us around with their chairs. We actually had a meeting at the art school in Melbourne, attached to the Melbourne, the museum there. We had a panel with critics, with working critics in Australia. Next. And we had a little bit of a tour at one point, actually, to the Blue Mountains, which are very beautiful. And we were the co-PIs. So there's in the picture on the left, we were riding an elevated train in the Blue Mountains, and there's me on the left, and then Jenny, and then Moen Mathen from Toronto, and Paul Geyer, who also needs no introduction, I assume. So we were the main participants in the project. Next. And it wound up with various publications, including a philosophy journal, the Australasian Philosophical Review, a whole issue on the lead paper by Moen Mathen on aesthetic pleasure, a museum journal, and then this book, Social Aesthetics and Moral Judgment. Next. So the issue that came up in our project was about how do you communicate with a community the cognitive contributions of art, and with an emphasis on aesthetic pleasure, the involvement of pleasure in appreciating and understanding art. Next. So now I'll go on to my example. Next, Rakib Shah does quite amazing paintings. And so there's a lot of pictures here, but I want you to see them because I want people to understand what's fascinating me so much about his work. Next. So one thing to note is that these paintings have unusual textures. Next. And they're done with gold, they're enamel, and they're very three-dimensional. This is a detail. They're highly detailed, as you can probably infer from the last one I showed you. And they're done with a gold paint that's slightly raised. It's a stained glass kind of paint that allows for dividers when you put the paint in the little channels. And then the paint that's applied is enamel paint, which is extremely finely applied using porcupine quills. And the level of detail is just mind-boggling. Next. This is a picture of Rakib Shah. He lives in London now. He's from Kashmir in India. And he's lived in London since he was about 19, I think, and he went to art school there. And he has he's done very well financially, and has this incredible warehouse that he's redone into a fantastic garden space. Next. Here's a picture of him. He's born in 1974. His family were Muslims, but he went to either Catholic schools in Kashmir. When they had to leave Kashmir, they lived for a while in Delhi, and he went to Hindu schools. The family were art and antique dealers, so he grew up amongst a whole array of decorative textiles, carpets, jewelry, and other kinds of Asian arts. Went to art school in London beginning in 1998. The family disowned him, so he's very poor for a while because he left the family business. And now he lives and works in London, and that's his beloved dog, Mr. C. This was a very interesting review that caught my attention from the Washington Post by Sebastian Smee, who's their art reviewer. And I love the title. So I'm trying to bring in an art critic here as part of to contribute to what your project involves. And I saw the headline. I couldn't believe this headline. I was sure I would hate Rakib Shah's work, then I saw it in person. So I was fascinated, and also by the images in the article. Next. So here are some things that Shah said. That this, when he saw the reproductions, he felt sure that this kind of work was just horrible and kitschy and decorative, and he hated it. But then he saw it in person, and he had a complete 180. The work is fastidiously planned and wildly ambitious. And here's a wonderful passage of criticism, I think. The elaborate technique is no gimmick. Rather, it's the expression of a sensibility which, in its combination of sadness and wit, camp and sincerity, self-aggrandizement and self-mockery, is so obsessive and unusual as to be totally original. That's a pretty nice piece of criticism. His work dares to register the brilliant kaleidoscopic puzzle of selfhood. Next. So now we're going to look at some more examples. And amazingly enough, after having read that review last March of this year, that is, all of a sudden I learned that the Rakib Shah exhibit that he was reviewing at the Gardner Museum in Boston was coming to Houston. So I went to see it, and I was absolutely enchanted and shocked. Okay, so I took some pictures there, and that's why there are going to be quite a few, but I want you to just see these to think about what's going on in them. Next. Now, since he's from Kashmir, Kashmir is a garden center. He calls it a paradise until the war broke out in the what was it, the 80s, and the family had to leave due to all the violence. So there's this garden, but it's kind of a garden of with something poisonous in it. So here's this beautiful, beautiful image, and they're quite large. And there's these two scorpions fighting down in the corner of the painting, and that's often true in his works. There are many sort of intimations of violence and horror and mortality. Next. And this is another image just to show you the incredible details. They're very large paintings, and you can just stand and look at one painting for half an hour at a time. Next. Except that it's sort of painful. This is an installation view from the Gardner. Next. And some other installation views from Houston. So to give you a bit of an idea of the size. Next. Another installation view. Next. And next. And so there's themes that Smee brings out, and that's one of the valuable things a critic can do. And I think almost anyone would notice these things, but there's a lot of things that you see in the images that you really can't grapple with because they're strange. There are temples on mountains, and there are unusual animals. And there are lots of figures that are from Hindu religion. And also, because he lives in London, he's fascinated. He sort of chose to live there because he got fascinated by old master Renaissance paintings in the British Museum. And so the paintings are full of architectural and other allusions. And I'll show some examples of this as we go along. And he turned out after his master's show, he got picked up by a gallery and started selling works. And, one of his early works sold for something like $7 million. So he was one of these instant overnight successes, and he's quite cynical about the art establishment. But at the same time, as Smee wrote in his review, there's a sense of, despite all the variety and the emdazzlement, there's this sense of loss and sadness. Next. This is showing his technique. This was from a video that they had on display in the Houston Museum. So that shows the outlining, and he's about to paint in his little dog there. And then you'll see the image next is the image itself that he's working on there. And so it's enormous. So you saw with the little dog, and there's the little dog at the top of this picture. And it's after his beloved dog died, Mr. C died. And so he had to do a tribute to him, and he based it on a Tintoretto painting of the Ascent of the Virgin Mary. And so this was, you just wanted to make the scene important enough that it would do justice to his beloved dog. So his beloved dog is going up over the mountain to a paradise somewhere. Next. This is him working on one of his images, and so you can see the incredible level of detail, although he now has a lot of studio assistants. Next. Detail of one of the images, Ode to the Country Without a Post Office, and that's Kashmir. And this is just a detail of a much larger painting. Next, I want you to notice the decorative stuff. I tried to take some images that would show the glittering nature of the surfaces of the paintings, and you can see the gold and how the gold works, but also he actually puts crystals onto them. So there's Swarovski crystals and other things. So they're like almost jewel encrusted. Next. And he usually includes himself in a self-portrait and somewhere in all of his images, and he's blue, and I've read that either he's Shiva or Vishnu, and some of my Indian friends have disagreed about who this is, but I'm going to come back to that later. And this is again, this is to show that image that Smee had part of in the cover of his the top of his article that you saw, and you can just see the incredible emphasis on decorative detail, and a lot of that is from the kind of place he grew up in, the family background, carpeting, wall screens, just incredible detail, and it's all done with that style, with that obsessive style. Next. And this is a video of him speaking at the Frist Art Museum, where he was explaining his process and his influences. And I took a screenshot because he's showing the kinds of decorative surfaces from Kashmir that he was used to and grew up with and that influenced him. Next. So he says, people call my art decorative, but that's my culture, and it's just why is that such a big issue? This was a very interesting image because it's a tapestry. So you can immediately see the distinction in textures, and the title is The Pragmatic Pessimist. I've got some details next. So this is showing a scene. He has these kind of apocalyptic scenes from Kashmir now being destroyed by fires, and many of the historic temples that are very ancient Buddhist and Hindu temples being burned. And so the world is burning. And one thing he is doing is he's throwing the stack of art books into the flames as part of the image. Next. And there are all these allusions to Kashmir. You get an image of the Himalayas and the snow leopards that are endangered and live there. Next. There's a close-up where I think you can see the texture is different, and that's because it's a tapestry. It's a huge woven piece. Next. And another image that's him in a kind of paradise environment, but the scenes are burning in the background, and it's set in Kashmir with all the lush flowers, the lotuses, the cherry trees, the Himalayas in the distance, and it's this loss of innocence. Next. Another scene with a art historical illusion and just an overwhelming amount of textures and details. And this is an allusion to a painting of St. Jerome. And of course, in the St. Jerome painting by Catena, there's a lion because St. Jerome saved the lion, and but he's got a snow leopard instead. Next. And that's just a close-up of him again, the self-portrait and two beloved dogs. Next. Just some more details. Okay, so you can go through these. Next, the beautiful flowers that they have, the incredible food. But again, as with the scorpions in the garden, you have these little rats that are eating the food on the floor, the riches of the produce from Kashmir. Next. This is an astounding painting. It's huge. It's really huge. And it's an illusion. And I forget who the painter is. It's another Renaissance painter who did a painting gallery. So Shaw says in one of his videos that he wanted to hold his own retrospective. He says, now that I'm, 40, I'm going to have a retrospective. So he created this painting of his own paintings. And there's 60 canvases in there, and they're each copies of his own paintings, some of which are in the same show. So when you stand there, I just was boggled. Next. It's so detailed. Here's another medium, sculpture, and this was quite shocking. And first time I'd been to the show, I didn't even notice it. And then I came back and I thought, holy cow, and here's people walking along with their children, and it's a rape scene, and he's the person getting raped. And there's this enormous lobster holding him down, and it's quite graphic if you stand there and stare at it. And I was kind of horrified. The man was walking past with his little children, and I thought, oh my goodness. So anyway, and the lobster supposedly represents, the title of the whole exhibit was Ballads of East and West, taking off from Kipling. And East and West, never the twain shall meet. And of course, Rakib Shah is the place where they meet. But the West, Western European colonialists ravaged Kashmir for jewelry. So notice the materials in this. It's very sparkling. Bronze with black diamonds, sapphires, and rubies. Next. So there are a lot of symbols in his paintings. When you try to understand the work, there's so many layers. There's places, landscapes, there's art historical allusions, there's symbols like the green parakeets that are native in Kashmir are symbols of souls of people that you're caring for. Next. And this was me I told my friends, this is when my brain broke, I couldn't do it anymore. Next. And this is a fascinating image, another enormous image. Look at the title, Last Rites of the Artist Ego at Shankaracharya Temple. And again, it's the architecture is modeled after another Renaissance painter. He's in two places here. He's standing and he's burying himself in the coffin, and he's it's full of these black birds, crows or ravens, and there are actually birds coming into the coffin and pulling out his entrails at the bottom of the painting. And again, he's blue in both of the images. He's blue for Vishnu. Next. And here's just some details and every individual crow in that gigantic painting has an individual nature, and they're all violent. They're full of violence. Next. And now, just last weekend, was it, or 2 weekends ago in Chicago, I happened to hear a wonderful talk by Emily Lawson from UBC on Indian aesthetics. So let's carry on, and I'm almost done here. I'm trying to get at the problem of appreciating and understanding an artist where the artist's work, like Rakib Shah's, is so amazing in terms of the form and the materials, but also so deep and complex in its themes, allusions, symbols, historical references, and so on. Now, one more dimension is, what about Indian aesthetics? All the things that I've read about Rakib Shah mention his background from Kashmir and the decorative arts, but they don't talk about Indian aesthetics. But he was educated by Hindus and Catholics, and Kashmir is the home of a lot of the major figures in Indian aesthetics. And so Emily, in her paper, was talking about these rasas. Yeah, that's her giving the paper. But now go next. This is one of the rasas, which are aesthetic modes of relating to disgust. There's 6 rasas of disgust that she described. And so, in Western aesthetics, we do talk about savor and discuss, like Horstmeyer did in her book, but Emily was talking about how one of these is basically the sage who gets to this point of being able to savor even images of death, destruction, and his own skull. So I see that as a way of getting at what's going on in that last painting where Rakib Shah was looking at himself in the coffin being eaten by birds as he's dead next. So I compared it to this image she showed. And that's it. I'm sorry. It's a little, Guy assured me that I didn't have to be polished. So this is what you get. And that's the image from the tapestry where he's actually putting all his art books into the flames in order to provide warmth for all of these animals. And so it's surrounded by polar bears, and it's about climate change. Okay, I'll shut up now. Thank you for listening.
And thank you for talking, Cynthia. It's been a fascinating presentation. Really great, Cynthia. And I must confess I was not particularly aware of Rakib Shaw before you sent me some of the images, and I was intrigued and found myself, unable to. There's so much to draw the eye in. So it's a really interesting example, and also a really interesting angle to bring in connection with this kind of puzzle over what kind of form this communication takes in artistic context. So that was a really rich discussion. Thank you very much. Sonia.
Hi, Cynthia. Thank you. I thought that was just super, super interesting. Thank you so much. So I just want to follow up on Kant, since that's where you started, and I've been thinking about nothing but Kant for about 4 months, and also about cognitivism. As you were talking, it seemed to me that you were describing two things, which I think of as the leading controlling ideas in Kant. One is that beauty in general expresses aesthetic ideas through aesthetic attributes. And the second one is that what beauty evokes, which undergirds the analytic, is the free play of imagination and understanding. And I just thought that's what you kept in a way trying to describe, that it evoked in you this free play, that the aesthetic attributes and which convey, right? You explain to us the unique aesthetic attributes that this artist has developed, and you tried to convey the aesthetic ideas which sort of go beyond encapsulation by concepts that we have, that they were expressing, and the way this was evoking in you this free play where your imagination kept working with the determinate nature of the works, and your understanding was trying to understand and throwing in concepts and what you knew and the illusions he was making. So it just seemed so perfectly Kantian in a way, nothing formalist about it, I would suggest. But then I was wondering about this, whether you could speak to this and this description, if it captures what you were doing, to the theme of cognitivism, because Kant is precisely, I think, avoiding cognitivism. He's trying not to land on the side of either the imagination or the understanding, right? He's saying their intention, they can't resolve, they keep trying to work and cooperate, and they can never give us a conceptual or cognitive understanding. So I was just wondering if you'd like to talk about that, maybe not.
I'm not a Kant scholar, so I'm a little hesitant. The one screen I skipped over was something that was a short summary of Paul Guyer and his contribution to that volume that came out of the project that we had down in Australia. So this is the book right here, the Social Aesthetics and Moral Judgment. And his paper is on threefoldness. So he tries to go beyond, he tries to interpret, what is it, Wolheim and Santayana talking about threefoldness, going beyond twofoldness, and so beyond seeing in, and so so threefoldness, if I'm remembering it, has to do with you have the sort of form and the imagination and then the concept, and so Geyer gives an account that's very similar to what you were just saying, but with a little bit more emphasis on the aesthetic ideas, sort of pushing Kant into the cognitivist ballpark, And so, but he doesn't go all the way there. And so that's partly why I was doing the references to Jenny, because she doesn't, she says Kant is definitely not a cognitivist. So I think, that's pretty clear. And yet she's also trying to emphasize how aesthetic ideas work to get us to the realm of understanding. And so, what Paul says in his paper is that Kant had no real appreciation for anything that had to do with the emotional aspects of art. And so, but Paul in his paper says that there is a important way in which the emotions that come from the play of imagination and the material aspects of art are also cognitively important too. And so you can have, something like I know Guy's a music critic, something like profundity in Bach, right? Or in Beethoven, I guess we had that example a few weeks ago. And so I would say, since I've written on Rothko and color, I would say you get something similar in the emotional part of Rothko's paintings, where it's emotional, but you have I think there are cognitive implications from it. So I go all the way there, even though I don't. I know that the Kant scholars don't, and that's more accurate for Kant. But in my paper, Art and Moral Knowledge, I talk about two main sources of cognitive accounts of art: Nussbaum's Aristotelian view and Putnam's and Goodman's pragmatist view, and that's where I am. I'm with both of those. Okay, so I'm not a Kantian.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you for being here.
Brilliant, brilliant. Peter, you have a question. Am I interpreting your wave correctly?
But well, thank you, Cynthia, very much. As Guy said, I mean, like him, I hadn't heard of the artist or reflected on his work at all. So I'm going to be sort of blunt in a way. I mean, with this theme of the project is, of course, the cognitivism. So in a way, I'm following up on the Sonia's question and the points you raised just now. You prefix the discussion with using the expression communicating values. And that you were interested in how art communicates values. And I wondered how that was playing out in your examples, Sonia. No, Cynthia. I mean, what you did, you talked us through in a fascinating way, the themes that were coming out, the ideas, the politics, the illusions, the satire, and so on. In other words, you were doing a job on, in effect, interpreting the works and having something to say about, what the meanings are and so on. But I wondered, those comments were so closely connected to particular images that I wondered how you take the next step, which is to say, and what these works are doing is communicating values.
Yeah, no.
You were communicating were things about the works in a fascinating detail, and you showed it. But where's the next step? And
that's the right question. Yes, and I'm not there yet. I haven't arrived at it yet. No, I'd like to think that art can succeed at this, and that we can show how it succeeds And so when going back to my Riyadh, the preface in what my talk in Riyadh, I did talk about Ai Weiwei. And I used that specifically to talk about art communicating values because Ai Weiwei is clearly criticizing aspects of the Chinese government when he does certain of his works, or he's criticizing Europeans when he did all these works about dead refugees and lifeboats with people falling off of them because they're dead. So I think it's pretty clear in that case, he's communicating the value that, what's wrong with you people that you won't take in refugees, So for Rakib Shah, I think he's a much more subtle artist. And I am a little worried about this because I'm worried about the audio guide problem that Thi Nguyen has written on, because everybody in the show in Houston had the audio guide on their ears, and I just despise them. I won't touch them. But then I read all the wall plaques very carefully, and they give, and I think they give like a map to the meaning, and I don't want that. I don't want, this means that, and this means that, and this means that. No. So I think I can see in some of the images, he's clearly dealing with humanity's destruction of the natural environment. And so that's something that's got to do with values. And he's saying, wake up, look what you're doing. We're leaving paradise. Um, he's from a Muslim family, and his mother's family were Sufis. His father's weren't. And but he's not religious. He says he's not religious. But I think what I was getting at the very end was my attempt to come closer to articulating values in terms of this Hindu context, because painting himself blue, rendering himself in every self-portrait blue, means something. And so I think that's the next step where I would need to go if I were to, write an article about him and values. And so the Hindu context isn't the activist one of let's fix the environment. It's more the aesthetic, not aesthetic, the distance, like I'm looking at the world and I'm not a part of it anymore. Here's the world, and everything's death and destruction and mortality. And I mean, he did say at one point, he says in one of the videos, he says, well, I don't know if the works or paintings are any good. He's funny the way he talks about them. He says, it's not like I'm a person who says, oh, I should make a painting. No, the paintings need to be made. He feels that way very strongly. But then he says, I don't know if they're any good. People say they're decorative and la-di-da. But, no one will know for 100 years if they're any good, and we'll all be dead by then. So anyway, I think there's that combination of backgrounds. He went to Catholic schools, and then he went to Hindu schools, and he's from this culture that's extremely, cosmopolitan, Kashmir. And so, because there's Buddhists everywhere. And so it's hard to pin down where he really is. And I think that's partly why I'm so fascinated by him.
Thank you. Good.
I might just step in quickly, if that's all right, because part of the premise of Peter's question was this kind of link to theories about cognitivism more generally. And clearly, Shaw is like an incredibly kind of rich source of examples for both kind of like cross-cultural communication in the field of the work itself, but also between viewer and work, so to speak. And something also struck me in this your discussion of Jenny McMahon. That she writes very specifically that it's partly a function of the indeterminacy of the content of aesthetic experience, that what is communicated is not kind of like cognitive content understood classically, but rather values and emotions, if I remember correctly. And I think that's really interesting. And just to relate it to the kind of general theme of the the project in terms of like marrying kind of cognitivism with a broader understanding of how communication and criticism work in the context of the arts. I think it's interesting to reflect on that we usually think of communication very strictly just in terms of communicating a content, and that content is, something like a proposition or whatever. And it's also clearly the case that you can understand the content of communication also in terms of the community which is formed through an act of communication. So there are two or more individuals who are brought together through this act of communication. And it struck me, well, you can also translate that to the concept of understanding, in the sense that it's not just that one person understands the other, but that two people form an understanding, as it were, of each other in an act of understanding. So these are things that are kind of at the heart of what we're trying to look at in the project to a certain extent. But it struck me that McMahon gets it, I think, exactly right, that it is partly a function of the fact that the content of aesthetic experience, and these examples are very good because they're inexhaustible in terms of detail almost, that you can't kind of extract anything from it, and the result of that is this thing of just so you're just there with the work or with the artist or your intercommunicator, so to speak, just forcing to rely on everything else to make the communication into something discrete. So I wondered, if you want to go a little bit closer into this discussion of McMahon, because it seems super relevant for us at least.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I kind of gave short shrift to exposition of her ideas. The book that I especially recommend is this one, Art and Ethics in a Material World, Kant's Pragmatist Legacy. And it's a fabulous book. It's dense. We had an author meets critics session about it at the ASA in San Antonio 10 years ago, 2014. And it was the three of us. This is how we came together. Mo and Math and Paul Geyer and I were the critics, and Jenny responded. I think her being in Australia made people not know about her and her work as well as I wish they had. And so it was nice that she was able to be there. And that's kind of how the seeds of the whole ARC grant project were planted. But so what I can do is I've got my comments from back then 10 years ago, and I could just send it to you. It's and you can share it with people. How's that sound? So that's not like I'm answering your question right here, but Jenny she gives a lot of art examples and talking about how this works, and it's very important that audience members communicate with one another and talk about works. And so she gives one of her main examples is Oliver Eliasson, and she'd actually she spent several months at the studio there with Oliver in wherever he works, Copenhagen or someplace. So I think that would do a better job than I can do just here on the spot, Guy.
That sounds very pragmatic, and it will be extremely interesting.
That's me.
Yeah, personally, that suits me just perfectly, because I'd really like to look at that in more detail. So thank you very much. We have officially 5 minutes more, but we're pretty flexible with obviously other people may have their own agendas. And we have, I think, 2 questions. So Edgar, do you have your hand up?
Oh, yes. I think Vid was before me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Vid.
sorry. Yeah, I'm happy to go. Yeah, thanks so much for the talk. I wanted to ask a bit more about the across cultures part. So there's one take on contemporary art from Terry Smith, which says that a lot of what contemporary art is about is also embracing a kind of global culture, and that's why, you have all these international biennials. And I guess someone like him might think of Rakib Shaw as marrying these different cultures together, right? So he's someone in London, but he's kind of combining the kind of Hindu myths with a certain kind of Renaissance, maybe iconography or something. But I thought you were also making a different claim, perhaps, that there's a kind of insight that art is giving us precisely when it is in a coming from a culture different from our own, and maybe that was the what was also happening in your preface. So I just want to find out really if that's kind of where you're going with the current project, with this kind of claim that it's difficult to understand other cultures, but it's through art specifically that we can get an insight, or is that across cultures claim something else? Thank you.
Well, you're right that people like him, like Shaw and like Ai Weiwei, have left their cultures, and the cultures aren't that distinct anymore anyway, because of globalization. So Ai Weiwei has this Chineseness, but he's very cosmopolitan himself now. So yeah, I did want to try to emphasize the alienness that I felt in Riyadh, and maybe that didn't come through because not only were people dressed so differently, men and women having their bodies covered was a strange experience. You hear a lot about the women, but being around men with their bodies covered all the time was also disorienting for me. It's not like I stare at men's bodies, but you just start to realize when you can't see their bodies how it's weird. You don't really see their heads either, their hair, so they're covered up too. So, and also philosophically, they were talking about Al-Farabi and Al-Ghazali and Avicenna, and I know a little bit about those people, but I can't just like drop quotes out of thin air. And so there's this philosophical alienness too. And so I would like to take you back to Dewey in the final chapter of Art as Experience. It's called Art and Civilization. And he says, at one and the same time, he says, art is the best way to understand another civilization. But then he also says you have to work to understand it. And so, there's some essence of, like he says, Polynesian art, has an essence, and so that's something I'm not sure we would endorse anymore. But so I think maybe I view a person like Rakib Shah as a facilitator at cultural communication because he's positioned to do that. And so he's endeavoring to do that. And he's sort of alone in the project that he's doing. You do get a sense when you look at the work, that's what Smee said in his review, that this is somebody who's, despite all the details and the abundance, he's basically alone all the time. That's where he's got the dogs. He's alone. And so because it's such a challenge what he's doing. And so Dewey also says getting to know an artwork is like getting to know a person. That's very much like what Guy was mentioning a minute ago. And so you're coming to understand them and where they're coming from and what they need and what matters to them. And so there's just there's not just, this is true and that's false. It's not something like that when you learn about a person. You could sum them up like that, but that's not what's involved in knowing them.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Edgar, if you had a quickest question, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for introducing me to the artist too. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about the kitsch and if the category of kitsch, if it dissolves when you facing the work. Because for me, it was very interesting the example you gave of the critique, because for me, it remained kitsch all the time.
I see. Yeah.
I don't know if it's the same for you and what you think about this value or category of
I felt so overwhelmed. The first time I went, I spent an hour and I had to leave because I thought, I can't take this anymore. It's just, I just felt so overwhelmed, and it was kitsch, was kind of kitschy, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop staring. And so then the next time I went, I spent several hours there, and the gallery was much more full of people because it was about to close. The show was about to close, and I think, I don't like to say this because I just presented images, but what Smee says is true. You can't evaluate it until you see it in person. It's pretty overwhelming in person, and it's because it's just beautiful. I mean, it's kitsch. Yes, it is kitschy. I think it looks more kitschy in the reproductions. It's just astonishingly beautiful. And I just couldn't stop staring at these. And I could see people doing that. I mean, you know how there's some data about people spend something like 6 seconds in front of paintings as they go through an art gallery. People were just standing stock still staring at these works. There's so much to look at, and it's just so there's a kind of generosity to them, and so and the complexity. So I know what you're saying, and so maybe some are more kitschy than others, and others are more moving. And so, and I just think we'll have to kind of wait and see. It's too bad because I don't think people get many opportunities to see the work. And there must have been, I don't know, 30 or 50 of the, I've only touched the surface of what was in the show. It was overwhelming.
Thank you for listening to this recorded seminar from the research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospects of Criticism. To find out more about the project, please go to our website www.aestheticcognitivism.com.